Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping straight into a really fascinating area of mathematics today, problem posing.
Hmm.
Think about it. As Einstein and Infeld, famously said, the formulation of an interesting problem is often more important than its solution.
That really hits the nail on the head.
It's about that fundamental skill, right? Looking at the world and figuring out the key mathematical questions we can actually ask.
Exactly. I mean, solving problems is crucial. We all know that. But this ability to pose them, that's really where your deeper mathematical understanding, your creativity, kind of takes flight.
Yeah.
It's not just about getting to an answer. It's about having the insight, the spark, to even frame a worthwhile question in the first place.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we've really immersed ourselves in a comprehensive meta-analysis.
Right.
One of those studies that pulls together findings from a whole bunch of individual research papers
Yeah.
to get the bigger picture.
Synthesizes everything.
Yeah, exactly. And this particular one, it's published in the International Journal of STEM Education, and it looked at 26 different intervention studies.
26. Wow.
Yeah. So our goal today is basically to extract the core insights from all this research about how we can effectively boost mathematical problem-posing skills.
Okay.
And that's for learners of all ages. I mean, from kids just starting out in kindergarten all the way up to experienced teachers.
So think of this as your shortcut, a shortcut to understanding what truly works in this area, what might not be quite as effective, and maybe most importantly, why it all matters when we're talking about developing this essential mathematical ability
Right.
in ourselves and in others too.
Right.
We'll be pinpointing the key elements of successful teaching approaches and the factors that seem to have a real impact.
Okay, let's unpack this then. First off, what exactly does mathematical problem posing mean? It sounds straightforward, maybe, but the researchers we looked at found that there isn't really one single agreed upon definition.
That's a really good place to start. Yeah, there's some variation.
Yeah.
But the general understanding, and the one that this meta-analysis uses as its foundation, it comes from the work of Stoyanova and Ellerton back in '96.
Okay.
They define it as the process where basically you draw on your existing mathematical knowledge and you create your own interpretations of situations you encounter. And then you turn those interpretations into, meaningful mathematical problems.
Got it. So it's that critical step of taking a situation, which might be kind of messy, maybe real world,
Right.
and transforming it into the precise language of mathematics. And it's been described in a few different ways, hasn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Like sometimes as a logical process, step by step. Other times it's about the actual problem that gets created, the product.
Exactly. Or even as a skill that develops within a sort of learning community. It's been viewed as a cognitive activity, like what's going on in your head,
Right.
but also as a really valuable tool for teaching, and even as a learning objective in itself. What's really interesting, I think, is the growing recognition of just how important it is in math education. Research is increasingly focused on how problem posing can be both something we teach explicitly, like a goal, and also a really powerful way to deepen overall mathematical understanding. A tool, if you like.
And the potential benefits sound, well, pretty significant. We're talking about a much deeper grasp of mathematical ideas,
Yeah.
stronger general problem-solving skills, a real boost in creativity, and even potentially a more positive attitude towards math overall.
That's a compelling list, isn't it?
It really is.
It makes sense. When you're actively involved in formulating the questions, you're engaging with the material at a much more profound level, I think.
Yeah.
You're not just passively absorbing information, you're actively shaping it, making it your own.
But if it's so important and the benefits are so clear, why isn't everyone naturally good at this? The research highlights that learners, often face challenges. Sometimes they pose problems that aren't really mathematical, or they don't quite fit the situation, or maybe they're unsolvable, unclear, sometimes even contain mathematical errors.
Yeah.
You might even recall times, you've struggled with this yourself.
That's a crucial point. And think about it throughout most of our education, right?
Yeah.
The vast majority of math problems we encounter have already been carefully crafted for us.
True. By teachers, by textbook authors.
Exactly. We rarely get the opportunity to truly flex those muscles, to identify and frame those initial questions ourselves. It's just not something we often practice.
So it sounds like a combination of things then. Not having enough opportunities to explore and practice.
Right.
Maybe a less than solid foundation in the necessary math concepts sometimes.
Could be.
and simply limited experience in the actual act of problem posing. It's
Yeah.
like being asked to compose a symphony when all you've ever done is listen to them.
That's a great analogy.
Exactly.
And that leads us right to the heart of our discussion today.
Yeah.
What can we actually do about this? How can we enhance what the researchers call mathematical problem posing competence?
Okay, competence.
Yeah, and they define this pretty broadly. It's the collection of behaviors, knowledge, skills, and even the underlying attitudes or dispositions
Ah, okay.
that contribute to the ability to pose effective mathematical problems. So it includes cognitive stuff and affective stuff like feelings and attitudes.
So it's not just about knowing the mechanics, the how-to, but also feeling confident and motivated enough to actually give it a try.
Precisely.
And this meta-analysis you mentioned specifically focused on interventions where the main goal, the primary aim, was to develop this problem-posing ability itself,
Yes, that distinction is key.
not just using it as a side activity to boost something else like problem solving.
Exactly. These studies were intentionally designed to cultivate the skill of generating meaningful mathematical problems. And the meta-analysis then meticulously examined the different components, the building blocks, that these interventions used.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The researchers identified three main categories of these intervention components. The first one they called activity-based practice. What does that entail?
Right, so this category is really all about providing direct, hands-on experience with the act of problem posing. Pretty straightforward.
Okay.
So one component they identified was simply offering an overview of what problem posing is, just WPP, found in about 27% of the studies. It's about building that initial understanding, that foundation.
Makes sense.
Then there's the discussion of what good problems are, or WGP, used less often, maybe 15% of studies. This involves getting learners to think critically about the qualities that make a problem worthwhile, valuable.
That sounds really important, actually. You need to have some sense of what you're aiming for, right, in order to create it effectively.
Absolutely.
Can you give us maybe a practical example? How might that kind of discussion actually unfold?
Sure. The researchers highlight a study by Crespo and Sinclair from 2008. They engaged prospective teachers in exploring what made a mathematical problem good or interesting.
Okay.
And the criteria went beyond just, does it have a solution? They considered things like its potential to stimulate further thinking, its connections to broader mathematical ideas, its overall richness.
Right, right. So it's about the depth and the potential of the question, not just whether you can crank out an answer.
Exactly, the quality.
So what other activity-based practices did the meta-analysis find?
Well, the most common one, maybe not surprisingly, was engagement with problem-posing activities themselves, PPA. This was in nearly two-thirds of the studies, about 65%.
Wow, okay.
And it simply means providing participants with direct experience in generating problems. Just doing it.
Right, practice.
Yeah. For instance, Silver and his colleagues did a study where students were asked to pose problems before, during, and after they worked on solving related mathematical problems, so embedding it in the process.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. You often learn best by doing, right?
Hmm?
And the final component in this activity category is evaluation of posed problems, EPP.
That's right. Included in about 19% of studies. This involves getting people to critically assess the problems that they and their peers have created, looking back, reflecting.
So judging their own work and others.
Exactly. This process helps participants develop their own internal compass, their sense of what constitutes a strong problem, and importantly, to learn from both successes and missteps.
Okay, so that covers activity-based practice. The second main category they identified is method-based assistance. What kind of support falls under this umbrella?
Right. So this area focuses more on providing learners with specific tools and techniques methods to actually aid them in the problem-posing process itself. Scaffolding, you might say.
Okay, like giving them strategies.
Exactly. So one component is comprehension of the problem-posing situation, or CPPS, used in about 15% of studies. This involves helping learners to really understand the context, the constraints of the task they've been given.
Can you give an example of that? Understanding the situation.
Sure. So if you're asked to pose a problem about, say, a school cafeteria, understanding the situation would mean thinking about things like, what food is served, how many students are there, what kind of mathematical questions might even make sense in that setting.
Ah, okay.
It's about building a clear mental picture of the whole scenario before you start posing.
So it's making sure they've really grasped the what and the why behind the task before they even begin.
Precisely. Then another key component is the use of strategies involved in problem posing. SPP. This was in about 19% of studies. This is where specific techniques are actually taught to help learners generate new problems.
Okay.
And the researchers mentioned the well-known what if not strategy developed by Brown and Walter.
Ah, yes, I know that one. For those who might not be familiar, that's where you take an existing problem, you identify its core attributes or conditions, and then you systematically ask, what if this attribute wasn't there? Or what if it was different somehow?
Yeah, exactly.
It can be a really powerful way to spark creative variations and entirely new problems.
It really can. And a study by Putra and his team, for example, demonstrated the effectiveness of explicitly teaching and using this strategy.
Okay. What else is in this method category?
Other method-based assistance includes the use of problem-posing examples, or PPE, again around 15%. Just seeing well-crafted examples of mathematical problems can lower that initial barrier,
Yeah.
It provides learners with a model, something to guide their own efforts. Xiao and colleagues had a study illustrating this. It's kind of like looking at well-written essays before you have to write one yourself.
That's a great analogy. It makes total sense. And the last component mentioned here is the use of technology in problem posing, TPP, also around 19%. How does technology fit in?
Well, technology can add layers of engagement, right? It can
Yeah.
make scenarios feel more relevant, more real world sometimes.
Okay.
For example, Aiden and Monahan explored having students use specific math software to import visual images like photos or diagrams
Ah,
and use those as starting points for generating their own mathematical problems. This can create a more interactive, visually stimulating experience, maybe foster better connections to real-world contexts.
interesting. Okay, so we've covered activity-based practice and method-based assistance. That brings us to the third main category, environment-based support. This sounds like it focuses more on the overall learning atmosphere.
That's the essence of it, yeah. The primary component here, found in almost half the studies, 46%, is the creation of an interactive learning environment, IL.
Interactive learning environment.
It involves cultivating a classroom or learning space where individuals feel safe to experiment, where they're genuinely interested in the process of problem posing, and where they can interact meaningfully with each other about it.
So this includes things like encouraging open discussions about problems posed, fostering a really supportive atmosphere where, initial attempts are valued, even if they're not perfect,
Absolutely critical.
and promoting collaboration, working together.
Exactly. And that study by Crespo and Sinclair that we mentioned earlier about what makes a good problem.
Yeah.
They also placed a really strong emphasis on the role of classroom discussions in creating exactly that kind of interactive and supportive environment. It was central to their approach.
Okay, so those are the key building blocks, the components of these interventions aimed at improving problem-posing skills. But the big question, obviously, is, did these efforts actually work? What was the overall impact observed in this big meta-analysis?
Right, the bottom line. Well, overall, the meta-analysis revealed a medium, positive, and statistically significant impact of these interventions on mathematical problem posing competence.
Medium, positive, significant. Okay.
Yeah, to put it in statistical terms, just to give you a sense of the size, the mean weighted effect size was 0.72.
Okay, 0.72. What does that mean in practical terms?
Well, an effect size like that is generally considered a moderate degree of improvement. And importantly, this result was statistically significant, meaning it's very unlikely to have just happened by chance.
Got it.
So think of it as a pretty substantial leap, on average, in the participants' ability to come up with good mathematical questions. It's not just a tiny nudge, it's a real, noticeable difference.
So, on average, the people who went through these interventions showed a clear improvement in their ability to pose mathematical problems.
Yes.
The researchers also point out, I think, that roughly 76% of students in the intervention groups scored above the average of those in the control groups.
That's right, which is another way of saying it had a broad positive effect. That's a really encouraging outcome, I think.
It really is.
And the researchers also looked at the impact on different aspects of problem posing, like the sheer number of problems posed, quantity, the quality of those problems, and also non-cognitive factors like attitudes and beliefs about problem posing.
Ah, okay. And what did they find there? Any differences?
Interestingly, while the non-cognitive outcomes like attitudes actually showed the largest positive effect size,
Oh, interesting.
followed by the quality of problems
Mm.
and then the quantity. The differences between these three outcomes weren't actually statistically significant.
So better attitudes, better quality, more problems, but the difference between those effects wasn't big enough to be statistically certain.
Exactly.
But that makes sense, doesn't it? Just generating a huge number of problems doesn't automatically mean you're getting better at posing good or meaningful problems.
Precisely. Quantity over quantity, maybe.
Yeah.
It's the underlying understanding and the ability to craft those quality questions that truly matter, you think?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this leads us really nicely into the final piece of our puzzle today.
Mm-hmm.
What factors seem to influence how effective these different interventions actually were? The researchers explored several potential moderators.
Okay, moderators. Factors that change the effect. Let's delve into these factors that can make an intervention more or less effective. The first one they looked at was the research design of the studies themselves.
Right. And they found that studies that used just a pre-test and post-test design, so measuring the same group before and after, showed a significantly larger effect size. About 58% higher, actually.
58%. Wow. Compared to studies that included a separate control group for comparison?
Exactly. Compared to the pre-post control designs.
That's an interesting finding. Why might that be? Why would a within-participant design show a stronger effect?
Well, the researchers suggest a couple of possibilities. Within participant designs often have more statistical power because you're comparing individuals to their own performance over time.
Okay.
That can reduce some of the noise or variability you see when comparing different groups of people.
Right, people differ.
Yeah. However, they also caution, rightly, that these pre-post only designs can sometimes be more susceptible to other factors that might influence performance between the tests, things unrelated to the intervention itself.
Right, like the participants just getting more familiar with the test format the second time around?
Exactly.
Test wiseness.
Rather than a genuine improvement in their underlying problem-posing skills. So it's a bit of a trade-off to consider when interpreting those results.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the characteristics of the people participating, the learners themselves?
Yeah, they looked at two main things here. The educational level of the participants, were they K-12 students, prospective teachers, or currently practicing teachers?
Okay.
And also the size of the group involved in the intervention.
Did they find differences?
Oh, yes. Some quite notable differences in effectiveness here. Interventions aimed at K-12 students were considerably more effective than those targeting either prospective or in-service teachers.
Really? That's actually quite surprising how much more effective. Significantly. The effect size was almost 90% higher for K-12 students compared to prospective teachers, and even more, about 96% higher compared to practicing teachers.
Wow, that is a striking difference. Why do you think that might be? Why would younger students benefit so much more?
Well, several factors could be at play. Younger learners might just be more receptive to new approaches, maybe less set in their ways compared to older students or adults. They might also have a higher initial level of sort of intrinsic curiosity and motivation when it comes to exploring mathematical ideas through problem posing, especially compared to older students who might be more accustomed to a very traditional problem-solving focused approach.
That makes sense.
Also, as the researchers point out, teachers engage with problem posing in a more complex way. Right? They're not just learning it for themselves. They're also thinking about the pedagogical aspects. How do I teach this to others?
Ah, right. That's another layer.
Exactly. That adds another layer to their learning process, which might affect the measured outcomes in these studies.
Okay, that perspective helps explain it. Teachers are learning to pose problems and learning how to teach problem posing.
Potentially, yeah.
What about the size of the groups? Did that matter?
It did seem to matter. They found that smaller groups, defined as those with fewer than 25 participants, tended to show a significantly larger positive effect, about 72% higher compared to large groups of more than 50.
Okay, small groups better than large groups. That aligns with what we often hear in education, doesn't it?
It does. Smaller groups often allow for more individualized attention, more interaction between the instructor and the learners, and among the learners themselves.
Absolutely, and especially when you're introducing a skill that can be challenging, like problem posing. Having that more personalized support in a smaller setting seems like it could be incredibly beneficial.
Exactly. Very plausible.
Ah,
Now, let's turn our attention finally to the characteristics of the interventions themselves.
okay.
The researchers looked at both the number of different components included in an intervention between, remember those activity, method, environment components, and also the primary focus or mode of those components.
And what did they find about the number of components?
They found that interventions that incorporated more than one distinct component were generally more effective than those that relied on just a single approach.
Okay, that seems logical. A more multifaceted approach might address different facets of problem-posing competence. Makes sense.
It does seem intuitive, yeah. However, the findings regarding the mode of these components offered a bit of a twist.
Oh, how so?
Well, they categorized interventions based on whether they primarily focused on activity-based practice or method-based assistance or environment-based support, or if they used a combination, like two types or all three mixed together.
Okay, and this is where it gets interesting, right? What did they find?
Yeah, this was quite intriguing. They found that interventions that focused on just one of those support types, so primarily activities or primarily methods or primarily environment, were actually significantly more effective than those that tried to combine two or even all three types.
Wait, really? So focusing deeply on one area was better than mixing and matching across activity, method, and environment.
That's what the data suggests, yes.
Yeah.
The effect sizes were significantly higher for those one-based support interventions compared to the two-based or mixed-based ones.
Huh. Now that is a really interesting twist. You'd naturally think maybe that throwing everything at the problem would be best.
Right. More is better.
Yeah, but this research suggests that a more focused approach, really drilling down on activities or methods or the learning environment, might actually be more powerful.
It's a key insight from the research, I think. It seems counterintuitive at first glance, perhaps, but maybe. Maybe a more concentrated approach within a single domain allows for a deeper engagement and mastery of those specific skills or techniques,
I see.
rather than a more superficial exposure spread thinly across multiple different areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Spreading the focus too thin might dilute the impact of each part. Fascinating. Okay, what about the specific types of intervention components they examined? Were some particular components more strongly associated with greater effectiveness than others?
Yes, definitely. Their analysis indicated that interventions that specifically included method-based assistance,
Okay, the how-to strategies.
right, things like explicitly teaching problem-posing strategies like what if not,
Mm-hmm.
or interventions that focus strongly on creating that supportive and interactive learning environment we talked about.
Mm-hmm. The ILE.
Those two types had significantly higher positive effects compared to interventions that didn't incorporate those specific elements.
Ah, okay. So actively teaching how to come up with problems, giving students concrete methods,
Seems crucial.
and fostering a classroom atmosphere where learners feel comfortable, supported, and encouraged to actually try it out.
Yes.
Those appear to be really key ingredients for successful interventions.
That's a really strong and I think actionable takeaway from this whole meta-analysis.
Definitely. So, okay, let's try to bring it all together now. What are the main key lessons from this deep dive into the research on how to enhance mathematical problem posing?
Well, I think the first big takeaway is that mathematical problem-posing competence can definitely be improved through targeted, well-designed interventions. It's teachable,
Good news.
yes. And while using multiple components within an intervention seems beneficial overall,
Mm.
the research also suggests, maybe surprisingly, that focusing those components within a single area of support, whether that's activity-based practice or method-based assistance or environment-based support, might be particularly effective. Focus seems key.
Right, that focused approach.
We also saw clear evidence that younger learners, K-12 students, and those learning in smaller group settings tend to show the most significant gains.
Okay. And what are some of the practical implications of these findings? For educators, maybe, or anyone interested in fostering mathematical thinking.
Well, teachers can definitely look at intentionally integrating these key components into their classroom practices. Give some concrete ideas.
Like what?
Like, think about explicitly teaching various problem-posing strategies, those method-based things.
Mm.
Create regular opportunities for students to discuss and analyze what makes a problem interesting or solvable that's activity-based.
Right.
And, crucially, ensure a classroom environment, the environment-based support that really encourages questioning, exploration, and feeling safe to try.
Mm-hmm.
This research also really underscores the ongoing need for good professional development for teachers. PD that equips them with the knowledge and skills to teach mathematics, not just for the purpose of problem solving, but also through the active process of problem posing itself.
Teaching through problem posing, not just for problem solving. That's a powerful distinction.
It really is.
This has been incredibly insightful. It really hammers home the fundamental importance of not only being able to solve the math problems given to you,
Right.
but also cultivating that crucial ability to ask the right questions, the meaningful questions in the first place.
Absolutely. And it really makes you consider how these insights, these ideas about enhancing problem posing,
Hmm.
how they could potentially be applied in broader contexts, even beyond mathematics education.
How so?
Well, how can we foster that kind of innovative thinking, that skill of formulating meaningful questions in other fields, in science, in business, even in our daily lives when we face complex situations?
That's a great point.
How do we get better at defining the problem itself? That's definitely a thought worth exploring further, I think.
Indeed, it is. A great note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and walking us through this research on this deep dive.
My pleasure. It was fascinating to discuss.
Until our next exploration, keep those